The night was swallowing London whole, its fog thick against the windows of the British Museum in the winter of 1872. Gas lamps flickered weakly in distant corridors, casting long, trembling shadows across endless shelves of forgotten civilizations. Deep inside those stone walls, surrounded by fragments of worlds long erased by time, one man remained awake while the city slept. His name was George Smith. He was not a dreamer, not a mystic, not a man prone to exaggeration or fantasy. He was a disciplined translator, a technician of dead languages, known for his restraint and rational discipline. His job was simple in theory and overwhelming in practice: to give voice once more to the thoughts of the ancient world, carved into clay thousands of years before. On that night, his desk was crowded with tablets brought from the ruins of Mesopotamia, small, brittle slabs of baked earth, each etched with wedge-shaped marks pressed by hands that vanished before written history had truly begun. For years, many of these artifacts had sat unexamined, cataloged but unread, waiting for someone patient enough to piece their meaning back together. Smith worked in silence, the scratching of his stylus, the slow turn of a tablet, the measured breath of a man deep in concentration. Hour after hour passed. The world outside faded. Time folded in on itself as he followed the strange logic of the symbols before him. Then, without warning, something shifted. It began as a hesitation, a pause so slight it could have gone unnoticed. His eyes lingered over a line he had just translated. He read it again, and then again. His chest tightened as the meaning settled into clarity. What he was reading did not resemble theology. It did not resemble mythology. It did not resemble poetry. It read like documentation. Smith's hand began to tremble. Another line followed, then another, each one stripping away assumptions he did not yet realize he carried. The tablet was not speaking of gods as eternal metaphors or symbolic forces. It spoke of them as physical beings: flesh, blood, conflict, labor, command, logistics. It spoke of Earth not as a sacred cradle, but as something far more unsettling. Witnesses later said that Smith suddenly rose so violently that his chair crashed to the floor behind him. His face had gone pale. His lips trembled as if the room itself had grown cold. And then, in a moment that would become legend among museum staff, the reserved scholar did something no one had ever seen before. He began to shout, not in triumph, in terror. He ran through the hall clutching the tablet to his chest, his voice breaking through the ancient silence of the museum like an alarm pulling the past into the present. Words spilled from him in fragments, unstructured, frantic, charged with disbelief. He kept repeating that everything was wrong, that history was wrong, that humanity was wrong. The scene was so surreal that some believed him overtaken by madness. Others thought exhaustion had shattered his reason. But when colleagues finally gathered around him and saw the tablet with their own eyes, the laughter never came. Because what Smith had translated that night was not the famous flood story he would later become known for. It was something darker, something that quietly vanished from public archives soon after. The tablet spoke of beings who did not belong to Earth, beings who arrived from the sky, beings who did not come as saviors, but as rulers. It described humanity not as the pinnacle of creation, but as a solution, a manufactured solution, a labor force designed to replace another that had rebelled. The words on the clay did not say that humans were born free. They said we were built with intention, built with limits, built to serve. And perhaps most disturbing of all, the tablet did not describe Earth as humanity's home. It described it as an enclosure, a controlled environment, a system, a kind of planetary confinement, a prison that did not need walls because its inhabitants would never realize they were inside it. In the days that followed, those tablets were quietly removed from view. Catalog numbers shifted. Access became restricted. Explanations were offered in polite academic language. Preservation, pending translation, curatorial review. But among the staff, the whisper never died. George Smith had not discovered a myth. He had uncovered a warning, and once a warning is understood, it cannot be unknown. The Sumerians, the earliest architects of organized civilization, had left behind detailed accounts of beings they called the Anunnaki. The name itself carried a chilling implication: those who came from the heavens to the earth. Not gods of metaphor, not spirits of imagination, but visitors who worked, argued, ruled, punished, and engineered life itself. They came, the tablets said, not 6,000 years ago, not 10,000, but roughly 450,000 years in the past. Long before modern humans officially existed, long before we had language, nations, or memory. According to the tablets, these beings arrived during a time when Earth was still wild and young. Their purpose was not worship, it was extraction. Their planet was dying, its atmosphere was failing, and they required a specific resource to survive. Gold, not for wealth, not for ornament, but for survival itself. They built operations across the ancient world, and at first, they did the labor themselves. They mined deep underground. They carved into the planet's crust. They bled and suffered in the darkness beneath the earth until they broke. Their own workers rebelled, and that rebellion, written into clay over 5 millennia ago, forced a decision that would reshape the fate of an entire species that did not yet know it was waiting to be born. That decision was the creation of humanity. But the version recorded on the tablets was not a creation story of divine love. It was a manufacturing process, a biological experiment, a calculated act of necessity. And according to what George Smith read that night, the consequences of that experiment were still unfolding, even now, even through you, even through the silent beating of your heart. The question is not whether the tablets exist. They do. The question is why almost no one was meant to read that one, and why the implications of its message have never truly been confronted by our civilization. Because if the words etched into that clay are even partially true, then human history is not the story of a species rising naturally toward progress. It is the story of something built, something placed, something designed to forget what it truly is. And the deeper we go into the origin of those ancient records, the more uncomfortable the truth becomes. But before we can face that truth, we must return to the place where it was first whispered across stone, to the civilization that rose from mud and starlight, to the land between two rivers, to the world the Sumerians called home, and to the secret they buried beneath the foundations of human origin, waiting for someone to hear it again. The implications of what George Smith uncovered did not announce themselves all at once. They unfolded slowly, like a pressure building invisibly behind the walls of human history. To understand what the tablet truly implied, one had to step backward, far beyond empires, beyond kings, beyond even the first written prayers, and return to the beginning of organized civilization itself, to Sumer, long before Babylon rose, long before Egypt crowned its first pharaoh, long before the pyramids cast shadows over the desert. Sumer already existed. It flourished in the land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, a stretch of fertile soil carved through what is now modern Iraq. To the ancient world, this place was nothing less than the womb of civilization. Here, humans first shaped cities from mud and mathematics. Here, writing was born not as poetry, but as accounting, tallies of grain, labor, and distribution. Here, the wheel turned for the first time. Law became codified. Astronomy became calculation. Time itself was divided into measurable units. The Sumerians were not primitive. They were precise. Their gods were not abstract forces drifting beyond comprehension. They were named, cataloged, assigned domains, ranked in hierarchy. Their genealogies were recorded with bureaucratic clarity. Their conflicts were logged like political disputes. Their commands were preserved like state decrees. In the Sumerian worldview, the universe did not unfold through magic. It operated through order. And that order began with the Anunnaki. The tablets described them not as infinite beings of pure light, but as powerful rulers with physical limitations, political rivalries, and logistical needs. They traveled, They required resources. They built infrastructure. They demanded labor. They appointed governors. They punished disobedience. They were not imagined as symbols. They were written as administrators. Above the Anunnaki stood Anu, the supreme authority, ruler of the skies, and the one whose word carried final command. Beneath him were two sons who would define the fate of Earth, Enlil and Enki. Enlil was the executor, the commander, the enforcer of law. His jurisdiction was the surface of the earth, the cities, the order, the control, the discipline of those below. He demanded obedience without delay and favored stability above compassion. Enki was different. He was the engineer, the scientist, the architect of solutions. His domain was the Abzu, a term scholars translate as the deep waters, but which the tablets describe in direct association with subterranean chambers, underground waters, and the hidden infrastructure beneath the surface of the world. Where Enlil ruled through command, Enki ruled through design. Together, under the authority of Anu, they governed the extraction of gold from Earth's depths. The tablets describe this operation as global in scope. Mining centers stretched across regions now reduced to myth. The most significant of these was located in southern Africa, where ancient shaft mines, still cut into stone layers, dated far older than the earliest acknowledged human industry. For thousands of years, according to the texts, the Anunnaki themselves performed this labor, until they could no longer bear it. The workers who served under heavy burden were called the Igigi. They toiled in darkness, choking on dust, their bodies strained beyond endurance, and eventually they rebelled. They laid down their tools. They surrounded Enlil's residence. They burned their instruments, and they declared that they would no longer serve under those conditions. The rebellion forced an emergency council. The Anunnaki could not abandon gold extraction. Their planet required it for survival, but neither could they compel their own kind back into servitude without risking the collapse of their authority. It was then, according to the tablets, that Enki proposed an alternative, not a new workforce, a new species, one that would not rebel, one that would not demand equity, one that would not remember a life before labor, a being intelligent enough to follow instruction, strong enough to endure hardship, limited enough to never threaten its creators. The solution would change everything. The tablets describe Enki collaborating with a figure known as Ninhursag, the birth goddess, the biological architect of the Anunnaki. Together, they conducted a series of experiments using what the texts describe as the essence of the Anunnaki combined with the clay of Earth's primitive organisms. What followed was not immediate success. The tablets list mistakes, failed prototypes, malformed beings, creatures that could not reproduce, creatures that could not control their bodies, creatures that died quickly. Iteration after iteration passed, until finally the Lulu, translated as the mixed one, was born, the first functional human, not as a miracle, but as a result. And when that being stood upright for the first time, the tablets record a declaration that echoes across millennia. "I have removed the burden from the gods," Enki said. "I have placed the toil upon mankind." In that sentence, the entire purpose of humanity was defined, not to ascend, not to transcend, but to replace, to serve, to carry the weight that others refused to bear. The Sumerian records state that early humans were initially sterile. They multiplied only when Enki secretly altered their design. Population growth followed. Workforces expanded. Cities rose. Civilization surged forward. But even as humanity flourished above ground, the memory of how and why it began faded beneath ritual, worship, and normalized obedience. What began as forced labor transformed into tradition. What began as command evolved into religion. And by the time later civilizations inherited these stories, the difference between ruler and god had become dangerously blurred. George Smith had not uncovered a fantasy of ancient gods. He had stumbled upon something far more threatening, a narrative that framed the origin of humanity not as divine favor, but as operational necessity. And if that necessity once existed, then the question becomes far darker. What happens to a species when its original purpose is fulfilled? And what happens when that species forgets it was ever designed at all? To answer that, we must follow the story forward into the ruins, the inscriptions, and the secrets carved into stone, evidence left behind when the gods of old either departed or retreated into silence, because the earth still bears the marks of their work, and some of those marks should not exist at all. The weight of that declaration did not remain confined to clay. It reshaped the surface of the world itself. As the generations of the Lulu multiplied, the first true human settlements spread outward from the riverbanks of Mesopotamia, like veins carrying new blood through a dormant body. What had once been a planet shaped by divine engineering now became a world shaped by human hands. Hands that labored without knowing why they labored. Hands that built without knowing who had drawn the original blueprints. The earliest Sumerian cities rose where water and soil met in fragile balance. Uruk, Eridu, Lagash, Nippur. Each city aligned with a specific patron god, but also with a precise economic and administrative function. Grain moved between storehouses with mathematical efficiency. Labor was recorded with relentless detail. Production quotas were enforced. Every transaction, every worker, every offering was counted. Civilization emerged not as a spontaneous miracle, but as a managed system. And at the center of that system stood the ziggurat. To the untrained eye, it appears as a temple, a stepped pyramid of mud, brick, and stone, rising toward the sky in symbolic ascent. But the oldest inscriptions describe these structures in terms that are less poetic and far more technical. They were described as bonds between heaven and earth, communication platforms, anchor points, interfaces between realms. The ziggurat was not only a place of worship, it was a tower of access. From its summit, priests charted the movement of the stars with unsettling precision. The Sumerians mapped the heavens into fixed constellations and calculated cycles of planets with mathematical systems that would not be rivaled for thousands of years. They tracked celestial bodies invisible to the naked eye. They predicted eclipses. They recorded orbital paths. They described a celestial visitor that returned on a fixed, elongated cycle. They called it Nibiru, a wandering world, a crossing planet, a returning ruler. This object, described in the tablets as the home world of the Anunnaki, followed a massive elliptical orbit that carried it deep beyond the known planets before swinging back into the inner solar system on a cycle measured in what the Sumerians called Sar, an interval equating to roughly 3,600 Earth years. Each return marked a turning point in their records, a reset, a reckoning not only written into the sky, but into human memory itself. The Sumerians divided time not simply by seasons, but by celestial cycles. Their kingship lists extended backward not for centuries, but for hundreds of thousands of years. Early rulers were said to reign not for decades, but for tens of thousands of years each. To modern scholars, these reign lengths appear absurd, mythological exaggerations at best. But within the internal logic of the tablets, they follow a consistent arithmetic pattern tied directly to celestial timekeeping. The implication is unspoken. These were not human kings. They were something else, and beneath their reign, humanity functioned as infrastructure. The Abzu remained active. Deep below the surface, mining operations continued uninterrupted. Gold flowed upward through vertical shafts and horizontal tunnels carved into ancient bedrock, smelted in facilities that now lie buried beneath layers of forgotten sediment. It was refined and prepared for transport. The destination was not royal vaults. It was the sky. The tablets describe vessels that ascended from appointed launch sites, rising through fire and thunder. They carried processed materials away from Earth on schedules determined not by human calendars, but by celestial mechanics. Humanity's role in all of this was never framed as participation. It was framed as function, work, was survival, survival was obedience, and obedience became culture. Over time, the boundary between service and reverence dissolved. What had once been command became prayer. What had once been enforcement transformed into ritual. The Anunnaki no longer needed to issue daily demands. Human civilization internalized the structure. Temples replaced work compounds. Offerings replaced quotas. The hands continued to give. The bodies continued to work. But now the labor was wrapped in sanctity, and with sanctity came silence. The knowledge of origin did not vanish in a single catastrophe. It faded slowly as generations passed farther from the moment of their creation. The earliest humans may have remembered their makers directly. Later generations remembered only their presence. Still later generations preserved only their names. And eventually, only their stories remained. Yet the stories themselves never softened. The gods were not gentle creators. They were demanding rulers. They punished excess. They punished disobedience. They punished noise itself. The tablets are blunt about this. When humanity multiplied beyond expectation, Enlil grew restless. The population disturbed his sleep. Their cities grew loud. Their expansion pressed against the margins of control. And so he pursued reduction, not through mercy, through attrition. Drought struck first. Crops withered. Then disease followed. Bodies piled within city walls. Still humanity persisted. So Enlil chose final solution, a flood, not as cleansing, as correction. The waters rose with catastrophic speed. Rivers swallowed plains. Sea surged over coastlines. Entire settlements vanished beneath turbulent darkness. The vibration of the flood is recorded not only in Mesopotamian accounts, but across the oral histories of more than 200 cultures scattered around the globe. One man survived with warning, not because of righteousness, but because he was warned against the will of the council. Enki defied Enlil. He whispered instructions through walls. He gave measurements. He gave timing. He preserved the human line against the expressed wishes of authority. After the waters receded, the world was emptied. Civilization restarted from ashes, but the control remained. Kingship resumed. Temples rose again. The system endured, even as direct references to the Anunnaki grew scarce. By the second millennium before Christ, no living human could point to the gods and say, "They still walk among us." But their architecture stood. Their laws were copied. Their bloodlines quietly ruled, and their shadow remained woven into every institution of power that followed. When George Smith lifted that tablet centuries later, he was not reading a beautiful myth. He was reading a system manual, a history of labor, a blueprint of control. And what shook him was not the presence of gods, it was the absence of freedom. If humanity had truly begun as an engineered solution to a labor crisis, then the rise of civilization itself might not be the story of liberation we tell ourselves. It might be the story of successful containment. And that realization opens a far more dangerous question. If the original design still echoes in our genetics, in our social structures, in our unending cycles of work and sacrifice, then at what point did the prison expand beyond the minds and swallow the entire world? To answer that, the investigation must move from tablets into bones, from ruins into DNA itself. Because the most disturbing evidence of all may not be carved in stone. It may be living inside us right now. The idea that the prison might extend beyond stone walls and ritual systems is unsettling enough. But the Sumerian narrative goes further. It does not limit the control of humanity to cities, temples, or bloodlines. It implies that the architecture of confinement runs far deeper into the physical body itself. This is where the story stops being safely ancient. This is where it becomes present. The tablets insist that humans were not simply taught how to work, they were constructed to work, designed with thresholds, with biological ceilings, with lifespans short enough to prevent the accumulation of power across generations. Intelligence calibrated carefully. high enough to understand orders, low enough to never question the architecture of the system that issued them. This is why the kingship lists matter. Early rulers reigned for tens of thousands of years. Later rulers reigned for hundreds. Eventually, rulers reigned for decades. The curve is not random. It is declining. It suggests a biological shift, a restriction, an imposed limit. In the earliest ages, human lifespans were described as stretching into centuries. After the flood, those numbers collapsed. Lifespan compressed, memory compressed, continuity fractured. From a control perspective, this makes perfect sense. A short-lived species cannot organize across deep time. Rebellion dies with its generation. Each cycle resets the experiment. The tablets never directly state that this was done intentionally. They simply present it as a fact. And that silence is more disturbing than confession. Modern science has struggled to explain why humans age the way we do. Many species on Earth do not experience decline the way we do. Some show negligible aging. Some regenerate entire limbs. Some reset their own life cycles. The mechanisms exist in nature, but not in us. We are built to run down and then to stop. Even more disturbing is what scientists discovered when they mapped the human genome. Buried inside our DNA are 223 genes that appear nowhere else in the evolutionary record. They do not exist in apes. They do not exist in mammals. They do not exist in known ancestral paths. They appear in humans suddenly, fully formed, fully functional, inserted. The official explanation is horizontal gene transfer from bacteria, but the scale is wrong. The complexity is wrong. The probability is vanishing. Then there is chromosome 2. Every other primate species has 48 chromosomes. Humans have 46. At some point in the past, 2 chromosomes fused into 1. The fusion point is visible under magnification. It contains 2 centromeres. It contains the end caps of chromosomes, telomeres, right in the center, where they should not exist. This is not hypothetical. This is observed. Natural fusions occur, but they almost always result in genetic instability, infertility, or severe disorder. Yet in humans, the fusion propagated cleanly across the entire species. Every human alive today carries it. The odds of this occurring naturally and becoming universal are astronomical, but for a genetic engineer modifying a primate template, it is exactly the kind of change one would make to stabilize reproduction and control inheritance. The tablets did not speak in the language of chromosomes. They spoke in the language of essence and clay, but the effect is the same. Something was altered, not slightly, deliberately, and then there is memory. Not cultural memory, biological memory. Why does every human emerge into consciousness with no knowledge of where they came from, no remembrance of past lives, no retained wisdom from previous cycles, if cycles truly exist? If reincarnation were a natural process of learning, memory would be an asset. But memory is erased every single time. From a systems perspective, that is not spiritual. It is operational. A workforce that never remembers previous exploitation never organizes resistance across lifetimes. The Gnostic texts echo this with chilling clarity. They describe archons who trap souls in matter, who govern a false creation, who block access to the true source beyond the material world. In their cosmology, Earth is not a school. It is a containment field. The Tibetan Book of the Dead issues direct instructions for the dying on how not to be deceived by lights and voices that lure the soul back into physical incarnation. Plato spoke of the river of forgetfulness, where souls were forced to drink before returning to life. These traditions do not describe rebirth as opportunity. They describe it as capture, different cultures, identical warning. If the Sumerians were right, then the prison was never just geographical. It was biological, neurological, conscious. That would mean the bars are not outside us. They are built into us. And that is the first contradiction that must be confronted. humans possess extraordinary neurological capacity, 86 billion neurons, trillions of potential connections, a computational architecture so powerful that the most advanced artificial systems only barely imitate it, and yet we experience only a narrow band of reality, a thin slice of the electromagnetic spectrum, a tiny window of sound frequencies, a limited horizon of perception. It is as if a vast machine is running in restricted mode, locked, filtered, throttled, as if something deeper is sleeping or restrained. The tablets never explicitly say that human consciousness was limited. They simply show the consequences of that limitation everywhere. Fear ruled behavior, survival overrode curiosity, obedience prevailed over sovereignty, and even today, human civilization still oscillates between the same two forces, labor and fear. Labor to survive, fear of death, fear of displacement, fear of loss, fear of punishment. Fear is the ultimate control mechanism for a short-lived species, and it functions perfectly. If the Anunnaki designed humanity as a labor force, then the most efficient design would not require constant enforcement. It would require internal surrender, a species that polices itself, that doubts itself, that fears itself, that never fully awakens to the question of why it exists. And that brings us to the dangerous anomaly the tablets could never account for: awareness. Because awareness is the one variable that no engineered system can perfectly predict. George Smith did not lose his composure because he encountered ancient gods. He lost it because the logic of the system was too precise, too modern, too familiar. What terrified him was not that humanity had been created. It was that humanity might still be operating exactly as designed. But if that design truly exists, then the most dangerous thing in the world is not rebellion. It is remembering. And the deeper we investigate what happened after the Anunnaki vanished from explicit history, the more unsettling the pattern becomes. Because the architecture of control did not collapse with their disappearance. It evolved. It adapted. It learned how to hide itself inside human institutions, inside human belief, inside human identity itself. And once we understand that evolution, the final contradiction emerges. If the gods truly left, then who is still running the system now? If the architects of the system vanished from the visible world, the machine they built did not shut down. Systems of control rarely collapse when their creators leave. They become embedded, self-sustaining, invisible to those born inside them. And nowhere is that transition more visible than in the mythology that replaced direct rule. The Sumerian pantheon did not disappear when the Anunnaki faded from public memory. It fragmented, rebranded, migrated across cultures like a virus adapting to survive inside new hosts. Enlil became El, Anu became An, Enki became Ea, then Ptah, then Poseidon, then Prometheus. Names shifted, functions remained: the storm god, the sky father, the giver of forbidden knowledge, the law enforcer, the trickster engineer. Across continents that supposedly never spoke to one another, the same hierarchy reassembled itself using different languages and symbols. The gods no longer descended openly in vessels of fire. They ruled through visions, commandments, bloodlines, and intermediaries, and the role of humanity did not change. Still the laborers, still the builders, still the ones who paid in sweat what others claimed in authority. Every early civilization inherited the same three pillars of control: kingship, priesthood, and sacrifice. Kings ruled by divine appointment. Priests interpreted divine will, and the people fed both. The ancient temples were not spiritual sanctuaries as we romanticize them today. They were logistical centers, storehouses, redistribution hubs, labor registries. The old cuneiform tablets record workers assigned to temple estates by the thousands. Food rations were issued based on labor quotas. Failure to meet productivity meant punishment, starvation, or exile. Religion was not belief, it was administration. The gods demanded offerings not as symbols, but as sustenance. The Sumerians wrote explicitly that humans must provide food for the gods, dress the gods, house the gods, sing for the gods, and work for the gods. When offerings declined, calamity followed. The message was unambiguous. Feed the system, or the system will feed on you. Over time, sacrifice became ritualized. Animals replaced humans. Blood replaced labor as symbolic payment. But the psychological function endured. Humanity internalized the debt of its own existence. Existence itself became obligation. You live because you serve. That logic migrated intact into every major religion that followed. Even today, the moral architecture remains identical. You are born owing. You live repaying. You die still in debt. What changed was not control. What changed was visibility. As gods retreated into abstraction, institutions took their place. Empires inherited the same power geometry. Pharaohs ruled as living gods. Emperors claimed divine blood. Royal families guarded genealogies obsessively, tracing themselves back to sky ancestors. Blood was never just inheritance, it was legitimacy. And if the hybrid bloodlines of human and Anunnaki once ruled openly, their dilution over millennia did not eliminate the obsession with lineage. It intensified it. Across history, the ruling class has always claimed difference, different origin, different destiny, different right to command. Even in the modern world, power consolidates along family lines that persist across centuries. Dynasties change names, but not nature. Control passes quietly through genetics, marriage, and concealed inheritance. If the tablets are symbolic, then bloodline mythology is metaphor. If the tablets are literal, then bloodline mythology is camouflage. And in both cases, humanity remains structurally subordinate. But the pantheon did not only embed itself in politics, it embedded itself in the sky. Astrology did not emerge as superstition, it emerged as surveillance. The Sumerians believed the gods encoded their will into planetary movement. Every conjunction was studied, every eclipse interpreted. The heavens became a regulatory system, a symbolic oversight grid reinforcing the idea that authority was not merely political, it was cosmic. When people believe power comes from the sky, they stop questioning those who claim to speak for it. Even today, humanity stares upward, searching for meaning, while rarely examining the power structures beneath its feet. What the system learned after the age of the Anunnaki was that direct presence was unnecessary. Control does not require appearance. It requires belief. It requires narrative. It requires consent built on fear and longing. And as centuries passed, the most effective control mechanisms became invisible precisely because they were normalized. Work became destiny. Hierarchy became nature. Submission became morality. By the time modern civilization emerged, the chains no longer looked like chains. They looked like identity. This is the most refined form of containment, a prison where the inmates defend the walls, where the guards are replaced by ideology, where the laborers celebrate the very system that consumes their lives. If the original purpose of humanity was labor, then history is not the story of emancipation. It is the story of optimization. The mines became fields. The fields became factories. The factories became servers. The labor never stopped. Only the shape of extraction changed. And if energy was once measured in gold, today it is measured in productivity, emotional output, attention, and data. The harvest did not end. It evolved, which leads directly into the most disturbing possibility of all. What if the Anunnaki never needed to return because they already built a system that would outlive them? A system that trains each generation to operate the machine it was born inside. A system that converts human lives into continuous output. A system that feeds on effort, fear, and devotion without ever revealing what it ultimately serves. To understand whether that system is still active, the investigation can no longer remain in mythology. It must move into infrastructure, into economics, into psychology, into the invisible architecture that governs modern civilization. Because if this world truly is a prison, then the bars are no longer stone. They are numbers, contracts, beliefs, and stories that control what we think is possible. And the next layer of that control is not written on tablets. It is written into the algorithm of the world itself. The algorithm did not arrive with machines. Machines merely made it visible. Long before code ran through silicon, it ran through human behavior. The earliest empires were not built on metal or electricity. They were built on pattern recognition, on learning how to predict, direct, and extract human effort with maximum efficiency and minimum resistance. Agriculture was the first great upgrade. It is taught as humanity's triumph over nature, but it was also humanity's first permanent enclosure. Nomadic tribes could leave, farmers could not. Fields demanded constant labor, cycles demanded obedience, seasons imposed rhythm. Surplus required storage, storage required guards, guards required hierarchy, and hierarchy required justification. The gods provided it. Once humans learned to grow food in excess, they also learned to be owned by what they grew. Fields tied families to land, land tied families to rulers, rulers tied families to gods. The chain closed perfectly. For the first time in human history, slavery was no longer enforced only by whips. It was enforced by survival itself. Cities followed naturally. Walls replaced wilderness. Streets replaced migration. Calendars replaced instinct. Time became regimented. Labor became scheduled. Human existence became a unit of production. The pulley replaced brute force. The cart replaced the back. The plow replaced the hunt. With every innovation, the system did not liberate humanity. It optimized humanity. The earliest cuneiform ledgers reveal this with chilling clarity. They do not record stories. They record workers, quotas, rations, output, productivity. The earliest written language on Earth was not spiritual. It was economic. Even art was rarely personal. It served the gods. It celebrated kings. It reinforced hierarchy. Individual expression barely existed. By the time the first empires formed, humanity was already fully integrated into an energy extraction network far more complex than ancient mining shafts. The resource was no longer gold. It was output. It was obedience. It was continuity. The Sumerian gods decreased in number as power centralized. What once required dozens of divine figures became manageable under a single sky god, a supreme father, a universal authority. Monotheism was not merely spiritual simplification. It was administrative optimization. One god, one law, one chain of command. The system became leaner, more efficient, more invisible. By the time Rome rose, the gods had become political branding. Emperors were deified while alive. Worship was mandated not for transcendence but for loyalty. The divine became a psychological tool for governance. Rebellion became not only treason, it became sin. The prison grew taller, not in walls, in meaning. Later, faith fragmented again, but the hierarchy remained untouched. Kings ruled by divine right. Serfs labored by divine assignment. Women existed by divine command. The poor suffered by divine design. Every injustice could now be explained as sacred. When suffering is sacred, resistance becomes immoral. This may be the most devastating software update the system ever received. By the time modern science emerged, the old gods were declared dead, but the structure they left behind remained perfectly intact. Labor still defined worth. Obedience still defined morality. Hierarchy still defined reality. Only the language changed. God became economy, temple became corporation, priest became expert, ritual became schedule, offering became paycheck, and sacrifice became time. Millions of humans now rise before the sun, not because a god demands it, but because rent does. They work not because a king commands it, but because debt does. They obey not because priests threaten hell, but because systems threaten poverty. The fear is the same. The motivation is the same. Only the narrative has shifted. If the Anunnaki designed humanity to extract value from the earth and convert it into usable output, then modern civilization represents the ultimate refinement of that design. Extraction is no longer local, it is global. Resources move instantly across continents. Human attention is harvested through invisible networks. Emotion itself has become a commodity. Fear drives markets. Desire drives labor. Anxiety drives consumption. Every human impulse is now measurable, predictable, monetized. The gods no longer need vessels. They have servers. They no longer need priests. They have platforms. They no longer demand sacrifice through blood. They demand it through exhaustion, through distraction, through endless work that never quite delivers freedom. If this is a prison, it is not maintained by guards. It is maintained by incentives, and incentives are far harder to rebel against than chains. Which brings us to a dangerous inversion. What if the Anunnaki were only the first wardens? What if they built a self-perpetuating system precisely so they would never again need to supervise it? What if they left, not because they were finished, but because they no longer needed to stay? The prison would not need external rulers once the inmates learned to enforce it themselves. And that may be the most efficient control system ever engineered. Still, one question refuses to die. If this system is so perfect, why does it leak? Why do humans dream of freedom in every age? Why do uprisings never fully disappear? Why do philosophers, mystics, and rebels keep resurfacing with the same forbidden thought that something is wrong, that something is hidden, that reality is not what it pretends to be? These disruptions appear in cycles, and every cycle leaves behind forbidden figures, Enkai-like archetypes, bringers of fire, givers of dangerous knowledge, teachers of forbidden insight. They appear, are punished, and vanish, but their ideas remain, which suggests that whatever the system is, it is not closed. It is being contested, quietly, relentlessly, across centuries. And the next phase of this investigation leads directly into the realm where the system becomes most vulnerable. Not stone, not economics, but memory, and the war over who is allowed to remember and what. Memory is the most dangerous variable in any containment system. A prison can endure indefinitely as long as those inside forget that they were ever meant to be free. This is why the war over memory does not begin in battlefields or borders. It begins in archives, in language, in fragments of stone buried beneath dust and time. This is where archaeology becomes a threat, not because it uncovers old buildings, but because it resurrects forbidden continuity. In the mid-19th century, as European empires expanded across the Middle East, countless ruins were unearthed along the banks of the Tigris and Euphrates. What appeared at first to be little more than broken cities soon revealed something far more unsettling. Entire libraries had been buried intact beneath collapsed palaces and temples. Thousands of clay tablets lay stacked in ordered rows, preserved by fire and catastrophe. Nineveh, Babylon, Uruk, Nippur, Eridu. From these sites alone, more than 500,000 tablets were recovered, 500,000 voices from deep time, but only a fraction of them have ever been translated. Even fewer have been published, and some vanished entirely after being cataloged. The official explanation is mundane. Too many tablets, too few translators, not enough funding, not enough time. But this explanation collapses under simple logic. Over a century has passed since these discoveries began. Entire academic institutions exist for the study of ancient languages. The delays are not technical. They are selective. Some tablets move quickly into publication. Others disappear into basement vaults, and a few are quietly reclassified beyond public access. What distinguishes those that surface from those those that vanish is not linguistic difficulty, it is content. Fragments that align with established religious narratives are welcomed. Fragments that contradict them are quietly buried again. This is not speculation. Museum inventories themselves contain records of missing artifacts that were once present, copied, and then lost to undefined removal. George Smith's reaction in the British Museum was not an anomaly. It was an early crack in the wall, and cracks spread. One such crack appears in a text known as the Enuma Elish. On its surface, it is presented as a poetic creation myth, a tale of gods in conflict, of chaos and order, of divine kingship established through battle. But its structure is not symbolic in the way mythology usually is. It is technical. It names celestial bodies in precise order. It describes orbital relationships. It records a planetary collision between a body called Tiamat and a wandering object named Nibiru. From that collision, the tablets describe the formation of Earth and the asteroid belt. To modern astronomy, this sounds uncomfortably similar to accepted models of early solar system formation. But the disturbing question remains: how could the Sumerians possess such cosmological information? They had no telescopes, no advanced optics, no satellites, and yet their records align with discoveries made only in the last centuries. Even more troubling are the cylinder seals, small stone artifacts engraved with scenes so precise they resemble diagrams. On some of them, the sun is shown at the center, surrounded by multiple spherical bodies arranged in distinct orbits, not random stars, not symbolic dots, planets, including bodies that cannot be seen with the naked eye. Uranus, Neptune, Pluto, and the enigmatic 12th object, Nibiru. The academic response is cautious dismissal. They argue that these are symbolic, stylized, coincidental, yet symbolism normally distorts reality. It does not reproduce it with mechanical accuracy. The pattern repeats across independent sites. The Atrahasis tablets go even further. They do not describe origins through metaphor. They describe labor assignments, rebellions, negotiations, administrative decisions. The Agigi revolt is recorded not as a mythic uprising, but as a strike. The language is direct. The tone is logistical. Tools burned. Encampments surrounded. Authority pressured. The problem was not moral. It was operational. And the solution was production replacement, the creation of humanity. When modern scholars translate these passages, they often dilute the language into allegory. They soften rebellion into divine drama. But the original cuneiform phrasing resists that transformation. It does not read like supernatural fantasy. It reads like minutes from a crisis meeting. And beneath all of it runs a single constant: gold. Not wealth, not ornament. Gold as material. Gold as necessity. Gold as survival. The tablets never focus on jewels. They focus on extraction, processing, transport, storage. Why would primitive myths revolve so obsessively around a metal unless that metal played a role far beyond ceremonial value? Modern science now understands properties of gold that ancient people could not possibly have known. Shielding against radiation, conductivity at atomic scales, stability in extreme conditions, reflectivity for thermal control, properties that make gold essential in aerospace engineering. And suddenly, what once sounded like superstition begins to sound like logistics. The deeper archaeologists dig, the more contradictions emerge. In southern Africa, ancient mines slice through stone layers dated over 100,000 years old. These are not casual surface pits. They are deep shafts, supported tunnels, systematic excavations. According to mainstream history, humans at that time were barely using stone tools, and yet these mines extend for kilometers. Who dug them, and for whom? Near these mines, massive circular stone structures stretch across the landscape in quantities that defy standard explanation. Some researchers argue they are cattle enclosures. Others point to their scale, orientation, and patterned distribution as something else entirely. something industrial, something organized, something old beyond comfort. Archaeology is not supposed to support ancient astronaut narratives. It is supposed to dismantle them. But the problem is that the material record does not behave. It resists simplification. It contradicts timelines. It defies the limits we place on ancient capability. Every anomalous site is treated as an isolated curiosity, but isolated curiosities are what patterns are made from. And when patterns emerge independently across continents, across ages, across cultures, they stop being coincidence. They become signal. George Smith stood in the British Museum holding one such signal in his hands, a signal that would ripple through time, a signal that suggested humanity did not rise gradually from ignorance, but descended into it. And if that descent was deliberate, then the greatest crime in human history may not have been slavery, or war, or genocide. It may have been the theft of memory itself, and the deeper memory is buried, the more violently the system reacts when it begins to surface, because a prison can survive rebellion. It cannot survive awakening. Awakening does not begin with revelation. It begins with paperwork, with numbers, with lists that were never meant to be read as prophecy, but as routine. Because the most damning records are never poetic. They are administrative. Buried among hymns and epics, the Sumerian archives contain something far more unsettling than mythology. They contain inventories, delivery logs, work rosters, ration schedules, commodity tallies, documents never intended for worship, only for management. These tablets list quantities of grain issued to workers, beer allotments by rank, livestock transfers between temple complexes, tool distributions for specific crews, shifts recorded, absences noted, productivity measured. And among these mundane records appears a repeating anomaly, categories that do not fit human labor, designations that separate people from those who came from the heavens, not as spirits, as personnel. The Anunnaki appear not only in myths, but in payroll logic. Certain tablets detail shipments of refined materials leaving specific cities on specific days, timed not to seasons, but to celestial cycles. The language describes departure windows, aligned with the return of the great crossing star. Offerings on these days are not symbolic. They are increased. Production surges. Labor intensifies. Something is leaving. The administrative layer reveals what mythology obscures, that human civilization did not merely worship the gods, it serviced them. Temples were not only altars, they were depots. The priesthood was not merely spiritual, it was logistical. The most powerful city in Sumer was not chosen for beauty or population. Nippur held power because it was the command center, the city of Enlil. From there, distribution flowed outward like arteries in a controlled body. The tablets described Nippur as the place where the bond of heaven and earth is fastened. But the economic texts describe it as the central node through which resources were allocated, projects approved, and labor reassigned. It was not a holy city. It was an operations hub. From Nippur, Enlil's authority extended over irrigation systems thousands of kilometers long. Canals were cut with precision gradients that modern engineers still struggle to replicate across similar distances. Water flow was controlled down to incremental measurements. Floodgates were synchronized across vast regions. This level of hydrological management could not be achieved through tribal intuition. It required modeling, forecasting, systems thinking, and someone taught it. Even the calendar itself reflects this command structure. The Sumerians divided the year into precise segments, not based on agricultural convenience alone, but on celestial timing. Labor cycles followed sky cycles. Offerings peaked at conjunctions. Major construction projects began during specific planetary alignments. The sky dictated production, which raises a dangerous question. Who set that schedule? Seals recovered from administrative buildings deepened the unease. These small cylinder seals functioned as signatures. Rolled across soft clay, they authenticated documents and ownership. Most show gods receiving offerings, kings kneeling, devotees praying. But a minority shows something else. Figures inside enclosed structures, operating devices, winged beings manipulating tools, craft descending from the sky, starbursts erupting from platforms. These are not religious scenes, they are technical vignettes. The seals were not designed for storytelling. They were designed to authorize transactions, which means these images were not symbolic fantasies. They represented realities understood by the administrators who used them. Even more disturbing are the ration tablets issued during periods of catastrophe. During floods, plagues, and droughts, the records do not show compassion. They show prioritization. Certain classes of workers continued receiving full rations. Others were reduced. Some were eliminated. The logic is unmistakable. Resource preservation, not mercy. Survival of function, not survival of people. This is not how a loving religious system behaves. It is how an extraction system behaves under stress. The tablets describe the flood not only in epic form, but in aftermath records. There are disruptions in accounting, sudden drops in workforce, emergency reallocations, project delays, restart protocols, new population tallies. Civilization resets do not read like divine punishment in these documents. They read like system recovery. Even kingship appears here, not as sacred inheritance, but as operational continuity. Kings are selected not merely for bloodline, but for compliance with temple directives. The first duty of every king was not to his people, it was to the gods, or more precisely, to the apparatus that spoke in their name. This apparatus endured even after the Anunnaki faded from direct mention. Temple economies expanded. State religions consolidated. The priesthood became a class unto itself. Knowledge became gated. Access became controlled. Memory became curated. And the people became strangers to their own origin. The administrative order outlived the administrators. That is the hallmark of true system design. You do not need to occupy a territory forever if you can teach the territory to occupy itself. You do not need to rule openly if the population has been trained to reproduce the rules on its own. The Anunnaki vanish from later texts, not because their influence ended, but because it had already succeeded. The machine no longer required visible operators, only participants, only believers, only workers, and that is what makes George Smith's reaction so telling. He did not stumble over a sensational myth. He found evidence of infrastructure, of bureaucracy, of a civilization that was never merely worshiping gods. It was maintaining a supply chain, and supply chains do not exist without destination, which leads to the most dangerous inference of all. If the machine continued long after its builders disappeared, then the destination may still exist, out of sight, off-world, or hidden within layers of reality we do not yet know how to see. And once that possibility is allowed, the investigation can no longer limit itself to the ancient past. It must follow the trail into digital networks, satellite grids, and systems so vast that no single human mind can comprehend them. Because the prison of stone may have collapsed long ago, but the prison of structure is stronger than ever. The machine does not announce itself. It does not roar. It does not conquer with banners or armies. It grows silently, one habit at a time, one ritual at a time, one unquestioned assumption layered gently over another until the structure becomes invisible. By the time a civilization realizes it is inside a system, the system has already become indistinguishable from reality itself. This is where the human story truly turns. Because somewhere between the last direct mentions of the Anunnaki and the rise of human kings, something remarkable happened. Control transformed. It learned to replicate without supervision. It learned to perpetuate itself through belief instead of force. The Sumerian word for king originally did not mean ruler of people. It meant caretaker of divine infrastructure. The first kings were not sovereigns. They were stewards. Their primary duty was not to govern humanity. It was to preserve the systems left behind, the canals, the temples, the calendars, the labor cycles, the celestial observatories, the production quotas, the astronomical counting, These things were too important to abandon, even after the gods were gone. And this is where the story becomes dangerous, because it reveals how occupation evolves into culture. The early kings of Sumer did not claim to be gods. They claimed to be chosen by gods. Selection replaced presence. Authority replaced visibility. By the time Akkad rose, the divine right was no longer a logistical appointment. It was theological law. The transition is encoded directly in royal inscriptions. Early rulers say, Enlil appointed me. Later rulers say, I am the image of Enlil. Eventually they say, I am Enlil on earth. As the original administrators withdrew, their authority was transferred into symbolic inheritance, into bloodlines, into crowns, into rituals, into mandatory reverence. Power no longer descended from the sky. It descended through family, and once authority becomes hereditary, the machine no longer requires instruction. It reproduces itself biologically. This is the moment when the prison becomes permanent, not through chains, through identity. From this point forward, humanity did not work for visible gods. It worked for kings. It did not bring offerings to beings from the sky. It brought taxes to palaces. It did not fear divine punishment from above. It feared punishment from armies below. But the structure beneath it all remained unchanged. Labor flows upward. Resources exit. Belief stabilizes everything. As this transformation unfolded across Mesopotamia, the same pattern appeared elsewhere, as if the template itself were operationalizing across continents. In Egypt, the pharaoh becomes the living god. In China, the emperor rules through the mandate of heaven. In Mesoamerica, kings are blood descendants of sky beings. In the Andes, rulers descend from the sun. Different myths, same architecture of power. The sky remains the source of legitimacy, and the people remain the engine. What changes next is subtle and terrifying, because once the gods live only in belief, belief itself becomes the control mechanism. You no longer need to station enforcers in temples if guilt, fear, and devotion enforce behavior automatically. You no longer need to issue commands if moral law programs obedience internally. You no longer need overseers if the population watches itself. The Sumerian priesthood becomes the prototype for all future authority systems. They guard the calendar. They define the sacred days. They decide when labor pauses and resumes. They interpret signs. They declare disasters as punishment. They declare kings as chosen. They regulate reproduction through inheritance law. They record births, deaths, and marriages. They become the nerve center of reality itself. And from this priesthood, every future institution descends. Church, state, bank, corporation, all different costumes for the same operating system. The original machine was built to manage extraction and survival across cosmic timescales. The new machine is built to manage extraction and survival across human lifetimes. But the purpose does not change. What changes is the resource. Gold becomes grain. Grain becomes land. Land becomes currency. Currency becomes data. Data becomes attention. Attention becomes emotion. Emotion becomes energy. The extraction never stops. Only the form changes. This is why the Sumerian narrative of humanity's creation as a labor species refuses to die, because it keeps harmonizing with lived experience. Because the deeper technology becomes more advanced, the more the ancient metaphor starts to look literal again. Humans wake up each morning and exchange time for survival. They trade irreplaceable consciousness for symbolic numbers. They age rapidly while the systems they serve remain ageless. They are born into debt. They labor inside structures they did not design. They obey rules they did not create. They die before they can fully understand the systems that govern them. And then they are replaced. Fresh labor, fresh belief, fresh fuel. The demographic reset mimics biological design, short lifespan, high reproductive turnover, rapid cultural erosion, maximum stability with minimal accumulation of intergenerational power. A species that forgets just fast enough to never organize its escape. This is not poetry. It is systems engineering, and it mirrors the logic described in the tablets with chilling precision. Even the conflict between Enki and Enlil now takes on a modern dimension. Enlil embodies stability through control, structure through suppression, order through limitation. Enki represents risk through liberation, progress through forbidden knowledge, evolution through disruption. This is not simply mythology, it is the blueprint for every revolution in human history. Every time knowledge expands beyond permitted boundaries, Enki rises. Every time authority clamps down to preserve control, Enlil tightens the chains. The conflict never ends because evolution never ends, and yet the structures of domination adapt faster than rebellion. Because rebellion activates within the simulation, and the simulation absorbs it. Revolutions overthrow kings, then build new kings. Empires collapse, then rebuild as corporations. Religions fracture, then return as ideologies. Technology promises liberation, then becomes surveillance. Tools promise freedom, then become dependencies. The deeper the machine goes, the harder it is to see. This is the true genius of the original design. It does not control bodies. It shapes incentives. It does not enforce obedience. It monetizes survival. It does not hide truth. It buries it beneath endless noise. By the time humanity launches satellites into orbit, it no longer questions who first taught it to map the heavens. By the time it decodes DNA, it no longer asks who wrote the original code. By the time it builds artificial intelligence, it no longer wonders whether it itself is someone else's artificial creation. Because the machine has succeeded beyond any ancient architect's wildest imagination, it has taught the prisoners to build new layers of the prison themselves. The Anunnaki do not need to return to rule openly. The system no longer requires their presence. It requires only compliance, which raises a terrifying possibility that the original project is still active, that the extraction never truly stopped, that the gods did not abandon Earth, they outsourced it, and that humanity did not inherit the planet. It inherited the maintenance contract. This realization shifts the entire meaning of freedom, because if the prison no longer has visible walls, then escape is no longer physical. It is perceptual, it is psychological, it is existential, and that means the true battlefield is not in space. It is inside human awareness itself, which brings us to the next layer of the investigation, because the tablets do not simply describe how humanity was created, they also describe how humanity was limited. And the most unsettling restraints are not physical chains. They are written directly into the architecture of the human body and mind. If the original engineers wanted obedience, then biology would be the cleanest tool, and that is where the story must go next. If control is perfected through biology, then every boundary of the human body becomes a potential lock. Lifespan, memory, sensory range, pain thresholds, emotional regulation. Even death itself transforms from a mystery into a management function. And the Sumerian record, when read without mythological softening, hints that these limits were not accidents of nature. They were solutions to problems. One tablet speaks of the early age when humans multiplied too quickly, when noise rose beyond tolerable levels, when populations surged and the earth itself groaned beneath the weight of human activity. The gods do not respond with compassion. They respond with regulation. Disease is introduced. Drought is engineered. Famine becomes policy. Finally, when containment fails, the flood is deployed as a reset mechanism. This is not divine wrath. It is population control. After the flood, the texts describe a dramatic change in the human condition. Lifespans shrink. Fertility stabilizes. Memory fractures across generations. Humanity becomes manageable, predictable, resettable, and from that point forward, extinction events no longer threaten the system. They reinforce it. Short-lived species cannot preserve forbidden knowledge indefinitely. Long-lived species become uncontrollable. This logic appears again in the genetic collapse of human longevity after the mythic antediluvian age. The legendary figures who lived for hundreds or thousands of years vanish abruptly from the record. Their descendants live for centuries, then decades, then normal modern lifespans. The curve is not gradual, it is sudden. That suggests intervention. Biology does not usually transform on command. Genetics does not rewrite itself in a single epoch unless it is forced. And here, modern science becomes a dangerous mirror to ancient mythology. Human telomeres degrade in a very specific pattern. Unlike some organisms that regenerate telomeres indefinitely, humans experience inevitable cellular decay. Aging is not simply wear and tear, it is a timed shutdown sequence. Meanwhile, consciousness itself appears constrained in strange ways. Humans experience only a narrow electromagnetic band. They perceive time in a linear forward flow. They process reality with extreme cognitive filtering. Awareness arrives blinkered, full memory erased. Every birth begins from zero. This makes no evolutionary sense for a supposedly progressive species. Memory is an adaptive advantage, yet memory is precisely what humans lose most completely, and this loss aligns perfectly with the need to preserve control. A population that forgets its origins can be taught any origin. A population that forgets its prior oppression can be re-enslaved endlessly. A population that forgets its prior revolutions can be ruled in cycles. The Sumerians encoded this erasure mythologically. They said the gods gave humans a new heart. They said the old wisdom was drowned. They said knowledge was sealed behind veils. But the effect is the same. Humanity emerges into every age believing itself the first to awaken, the first to suffer, the first to rebel, the first to question the sky. And that illusion is the engine of the prison. Even death itself becomes part of the machinery. Rather than an escape, it becomes a reset point. The soul, stripped of memory, returns to embodiment with no recollection of prior lives, prior knowledge, or prior rebellion. The cycle begins again, with the mind freshly formatted. This is not reincarnation as enlightenment. This is reincarnation as containment. And across cultures separated by vast distances and time, the same warning appears again and again. Do not go into the light. Do not drink from the river. Do not forget who you are. Do not accept the false gods. Do not return without remembrance. From Tibet to Greece to Egypt to the Gnostic traditions, the language changes, but the instruction remains identical. Remember, which implies that forgetting is not natural. It is induced, and induction implies a mechanism. Whether that mechanism is technological, biological, dimensional, or something far stranger, the result is undeniable. Human consciousness is trapped in loops of amnesia. Awareness rises, questions form, systems react, suppression follows, catastrophe resets the field, and civilization begins again, over and over, each cycle slightly altered, each cycle slightly improved, each cycle slightly closer to total integration. This is why modern civilization does not feel like liberation. It feels like acceleration, faster labor, faster distractions, faster decay, faster forgetting. The system no longer needs floods. It has ideology. It has entertainment. It has controlled outrage. It has infinite noise, which brings us to the singular terror hidden beneath all of this. What if the Anunnaki were not merely ancient rulers? What if they were system architects designing a self-sustaining biological extraction species? What if humanity is not only a descendant of that design, but its final product? A species trapped inside temporal recursion, harvesting its own planet, extracting its own labor, surveilling its own population, enforcing its own limits, all without knowing who wrote the first line of code. And yet, something still breaks through, always. Myths of rebels, stories of forbidden fire, visions of awakening, whispers of a forgotten inheritance, fragments of impossible memory. These anomalies should not exist in a perfectly sealed system, but they persist, which means the prison leaks, and wherever a system leaks, something is pushing from the other side. The Sumerians called it the struggle between Enki and Enlil, the rebel and the warden, the giver of knowledge and the enforcer of order. That conflict did not end with the flood. It simply moved from the sky into the human mind. And the next phase of this investigation takes us directly into that inner battleground, because if control was written into the body, then freedom must be hidden inside consciousness. And that is where the system is most afraid to look. The inner battleground is not fought with weapons, but with perception. Once control migrates from external chains into internal architecture, rebellion must do the same. Escape is no longer a matter of distance. It becomes a matter of awareness. And this is why, across the ancient world, every true awakening narrative takes the form of a journey beyond permitted boundaries. The hero never begins by conquering a city. The hero begins by leaving one. In the Sumerian tradition, this journey is encoded in the figure of Gilgamesh. On the surface, his story is framed as the first epic tale of kingship, heroism, and loss. But beneath the surface, it is something else entirely. It is a breach attempt. Gilgamesh is not seeking glory. He is seeking the exit. After the death of Enkidu, his mirrored twin and symbolic equal, Gilgamesh becomes obsessed not with power, but with death itself. The death of Enkidu shatters the illusion of permanence. For the first time, Gilgamesh recognizes that even kings are disposable. Even semi-divine rulers can be erased. And that realization destabilizes the entire logic of the system he inhabits. If death cannot be escaped, then nothing achieved within life truly matters. And so he leaves. He crosses deserts no human should survive. He walks beyond mapped lands. He enters the forbidden mountain range guarded by hybrid beings who stand between worlds. These guardians do not test strength. They test intention. Only those who seek something beyond power are allowed to pass. On the other side, Gilgamesh finds a realm where time itself behaves differently, a shore beyond the ordinary world, a place where mortality is no longer the default condition. There he finds Utnapishtim, the survivor of the flood, the keeper of memory, the man who was granted immortality not as reward, but as function. Utnapishtim is not portrayed as a god. He is portrayed as maintenance personnel, a human upgraded to preserve knowledge across cycles, a bridge between eras, a living archive. Gilgamesh does not ask Utnapishtim for riches, armies, or dominion. He asks a single forbidden question: how do I escape death? The answer is not poetic. It is procedural. Sleep tests are conducted. Time manipulation is demonstrated. Biological regeneration is explained. And finally, a plant is revealed. Not symbolic, biological, a restorative agent capable of reversing decay. Gilgamesh retrieves it successfully. For a brief moment, escape is real. The system almost fails. And then something intervenes. A serpent appears. The plant is taken. Gilgamesh returns empty-handed. The message seems clear. The exit is discovered. The exit is demonstrated. The exit is removed. Not by gods, not by kings, by the system itself. Predators exist at every threshold. This pattern repeats globally. Prometheus steals fire. He is punished. Thoth gifts sacred knowledge. It is restricted. Quetzalcoatl teaches civilization. He is exiled. Oannes rises from the sea, then disappears. Every culture preserves the same warning. When forbidden knowledge is given, the giver is destroyed. When forbidden memory is recovered, catastrophe follows. When escape becomes plausible, the gate closes. This is not coincidence. It is security protocol. The system tolerates suffering. It tolerates inequality. It tolerates rebellion, but it does not tolerate escape. And this is where the journey becomes truly dangerous. Because once the mythic layer is stripped away, the ancient quest for immortality begins to look suspiciously like a search for technological transcendence, biological mastery, consciousness preservation, memory continuity, cycle interruption. These are not spiritual goals. They are engineering objectives. Modern science now chases these same targets openly. Life extension, neural backup, artificial bodies, digital cognition, quantum memory. The same forbidden questions have returned wearing laboratory coats. How long before death is no longer necessary? How long before memory is no longer erased? How long before the reset mechanism fails? If the Anunnaki once solved these problems for themselves and then denied those solutions to humanity, then the ancient myths of stolen fire and lost immortality take on a new meaning. They are records not of fantasy, but of thefts reversed. And the greatest theft was not the loss of eternal life. It was the confiscation of continuity. Each time a human dies without remembrance, the system succeeds. Each time a human awakens to the pattern, the system reacts. And that reaction is never random. It is surgical. Which brings us to the next critical figure in the narrative. Not a king, not a god, but a witness. A keeper of knowledge who survives when all others are erased. Because every time the system resets the world, it leaves behind just enough memory to rebuild the prison again. And that memory always lives with someone who should not exist at all. The memory that survives extinction never belongs to kings. It does not live in temples. It is not entrusted to rulers or armies. It is carried by a figure who exists in the margins of every civilization, appearing only after the flames have passed and the waters have retreated. The keeper of secrets is not a title. It is a function. And once the pattern is recognized, this figure emerges everywhere. Utnapishtim is only one version. Noah is another. Ziusudra, Manu, Deucalion, Atrahasis. Each culture preserves a survivor who is not celebrated for conquest, but for custody. These figures do not rule the new world. They retreat from it. They do not build empires. They preserve instructions. The flood ends, humanity rebuilds, and the keeper withdraws into silence, leaving behind fragments calibrated to activate long after their disappearance. This is the signature of controlled continuity. The keeper is never portrayed as powerful in the way kings are powerful. Instead, they are burdened, isolated, removed from ordinary human timelines. Immortality, when granted, is not a gift of pleasure. It is a sentence of witness. To live while everyone else resets is to observe the machinery beneath history. In Sumerian traditions, Utnapishtim does not return to society. He is placed beyond the rivers, beyond the mapped world, where he cannot alter the cycle he now understands. Knowledge of the system is not meant to circulate freely. It is meant to survive intact between collapses without disturbing the present generation too much, because too much disturbance destabilizes the harvest. Across later cultures, the pattern sharpens. The survivor is warned not to speak openly. The knowledge is encoded in allegory. Measurements are turned into myths. Data becomes ritual. Astronomical cycles become divine calendars. The language shifts from technical to symbolic, but the function remains the same. Preserve the warning without triggering rebellion. But sometimes the keeper breaks protocol. Sometimes the memory leaks. And when it does, civilizations experience sudden accelerations of knowledge that defy linear development. Mathematics leaps forward. Architecture appears suddenly advanced. Astronomical precision emerges without gradual buildup. Civilizations seem to skip steps. These leaps are not random. They coincide with encounters between humanity and forbidden continuity. In Mesopotamia, these encounters are credited to the Apkallu, the 7 sages who emerge from the sea and teach writing, engineering, agriculture, and law. They do not evolve from the population. They arrive fully formed, and once the knowledge transfer is complete, they disappear. In Egypt, it is Thoth, appearing before dynasties exist, already carrying the language of the heavens. In Mesoamerica, it is Quetzalcoatl, descending to awaken humanity, only to vanish again into exile. In each case, the pattern repeats with unsettling clarity. Advanced instruction appears. Civilization ignites. The instructor departs. What remains is the infrastructure of culture layered atop a foundation whose origin stories have been intentionally blurred. But the most revealing detail is what happens when humanity attempts to preserve continuity without divine authorization. Libraries burn, priesthoods collapse, calendars are overwritten, symbols are altered, measurements are reinterpreted. The memory chain fractures, and each fracture coincides with periods of extraordinary violence, climate catastrophe, or mass displacement. Knowledge that fails to remain encoded in myth becomes dangerous, because knowledge that becomes explicit invites escape. This is why the keeper always appears emotionally distant from the societies they save. They are not mentors in affection. They are archivists under constraint. Their goal is not to liberate humanity. Their goal is to ensure that the ledger remains intact across resets, because something larger than humanity depends on that ledger. The flood itself is not random in this framework. It is scheduled maintenance. The same is true for impact winters, pole shifts, megafaunal extinctions, civilizational collapses. These are not divine punishments. They are system purges, and the keeper exists to ensure that after every purge, the experiment begins again with minimal deviation. But deviation still happens. Fragments slip through. An inscription that should have eroded survives. A calculation persists longer than intended. A myth preserves too much accuracy. A monument encodes too many ratios. And eventually, thousands of years later, those fragments realign. Not in one place, but across multiple disciplines simultaneously. Astronomy notices something strange. Geology notices something strange. Linguistics notices something strange. Mythology notices something strange. Individually, each field sees an anomaly. Together, they form a pattern, and that pattern begins to resemble intelligence rather than coincidence, which raises the most dangerous question the ancients never asked out loud. If the resets are real, if the floods and firestorms follow cycles, if the keepers preserve memory across collapses, then who designed the cycle in the first place? The Anunnaki were not its creators. They were its operators. Technicians inside a mechanism larger than their own civilization. The gods were not gods. They were administrators. And like all administrators, their power was conditional. When they failed to maintain full control of the memory infrastructure, the cycle corrected itself. Their world was erased. Their bodies were stripped of resonance. Their identities fragmented into archetype. And their place in the hierarchy was removed. This is why the collapse frightened them more than death. They did not merely lose a planet. They lost their authorization. They became obsolete. And in that moment, the most ancient terror in the universe surfaced. Not extinction, replacement, which leads to the forbidden inference the myths were never meant to say outright. The flood survivors are not heroes of salvation. They are continuity personnel, and continuity only exists when cycles are expected to repeat. The keeper is not guarding humanity from catastrophe. The keeper is guarding the system from forgetting its own experiment. And if that is true, then every time you hear a myth about a lone survivor carrying knowledge through destruction, you are not listening to a story of hope. You are listening to a maintenance report disguised as legend, which brings us inevitably to the moment no keeper can prevent, the moment the fragments reassemble too completely, the moment the prediction becomes measurable, the moment the next catastrophe is no longer myth, but timetable. And for the first time since the last reset, humanity begins to calculate the cycle itself. Once the cycle becomes visible, catastrophe is no longer an act of fate. It becomes the moment when the pattern asserts itself through force. For the Anunnaki, that moment arrived without spectacle, without prophecy fulfilled in thunder, without a final divine decree. The collapse began invisibly, as all structural failures do, with instability so subtle it could be mistaken for noise. Their instruments were the first to disagree with their expectations. The stellar harmonics that had guided their calculations for millennia began drifting by microscopic margins. At first, the deviations were dismissed as calibration error, then as environmental interference, then as statistical outliers. But anomalies that persist cease to be anomalies. They become signals. And soon, every diagnostic system built upon Nibiru's resonance lattice began to register the same quiet distortion, not destruction, misalignment. The orbit was no longer closing perfectly on itself. The gravitational nodes that stabilized the planet's interior currents began migrating. The energy wells that had sustained the planetary field thinned. Atmospheric equilibrium faltered in layers so high they could not be seen from the surface. The gods did not witness fire in the sky at first. They witnessed silence in the data. The keeper understood immediately what the others refused to accept. The node was slipping. Nibiru was no longer synchronized with the lattice that bound it to the larger cosmic grid. And once a nodal world loses alignment, it does not drift gently into irrelevance. It collapses inward. Energy that once flowed outward through cycles now rebounds back into the core. Their world began to overload itself. Volcanism increased across regions previously dormant. Tectonic seams reactivated beneath architectures that had never been designed to withstand internal upheaval. Oceanic pressure systems destabilized, birthing storms that fed on their own rotational feedback. The sky thickened with charged distortions that bent light and confused navigation. Yet none of this was interpreted as the end. The Anunnaki were engineers of civilization. They had seen disasters. They had rebuilt worlds. They believed collapse was just another phase to be corrected. Then the resonance failed entirely. In a single rotational interval, the planetary field inverted. What had once distributed gravitational stress outward through harmonics now funneled it back through the planetary spine. Mantle pressure surged. Core density destabilized. The planet began to ring, not audibly, structurally. Vibrations propagated through every layer of the world at once, from inner mantle to upper atmosphere, shattering synchronized systems that had depended on harmonic coherence to remain stable. Power infrastructures failed first, then transportation grids, then atmospheric stabilizers. Cities went dark without warning. Not because energy was lost, because energy was no longer flowing through channels that could contain it. The sky ignited in curtains of ionized plasma as atmospheric charge escaped containment. Auroras spread across latitudes where they had never existed. The horizon fractured into bands of color and shadow as electromagnetic storms tore through the magnetosphere. And still, even then, the gods attempted repair. They erected shielding arrays. They redirected internal flows. They attempted to rebind the node using anchor geometries once designed to tether Nibiru to the broader lattice. But anchoring requires stability on both ends, and the lattice had moved. What happened next was not an explosion. It was a release. The core began venting accumulated pressure through planetary fault lines at velocities never recorded in natural history. Mountain ranges did not rise. They liquefied. Plates did not shift. They tore. Oceans did not flood. They reconfigured. Continents fractured in patterns that mirrored stress maps predicted only in the most extreme collapse simulations. Entire biomes vanished within hours, not underwater, not under fire, but under displacement. The gods did not flee at first. They stood at their instruments, recalculating in real time as parameters fell faster than computation could track. Their predictive models, once capable of spanning millennia, collapsed into seconds of uncertainty. The future was no longer a curve. It was a void. When the first atmospheric rupture occurred, it did not roar. It flattened. A pressure front descended from the upper stratosphere and erased everything beneath it in a silent horizontal sweep. Structures folded rather than exploded. Bodies were not burned. They were compressed into absence. Only then did the council fracture. Some attempted evacuation through dimensional corridors never designed for mass transit. Others attempted to stabilize fragments of the world in localized suspension. Many simply refused to believe that a nodal world could fail completely. But nodal worlds do not die gently. They fail catastrophically because they carry the burden of the systems that rely on them. The final phase occurred when the core reached resonance inversion. Energy that had once anchored gravity began repelling it. Surface gravity distorted in waves, flinging oceans into the sky while crushing mountain layers into the mantle. Atmospheric mass redistributed violently, stripping pressure from some regions and multiplying it in others. The world convulsed. And within that convulsion, the Anunnaki lost their source. Their power had never been intrinsic. It had been supplied. As the planetary resonance disintegrated, so did the field that sustained their forms. Their luminosity dimmed. Their coherence faltered. Their bodies began to feel weight, not metaphorical weight, mass. For the first time in their long existence, they were subject to inertia. Some survived retreat. Some survived translation. Many did not survive at all. Their technology fell silent as the planetary lattice collapsed into energetic chaos. The last images recorded in their archives do not show flames. They show darkness punctured by geometric rupture as the very geometry of space around the world destabilized. Then Nibiru was gone, not cracked, not broken, gone. Its mass redistributed into debris, ion clouds, and gravitational shadows that propagated through the local system long after the planet itself ceased to exist as a coherent body. The larger lattice corrected. The node was removed. The cycle advanced, and far away, on a smaller world that had never been meant to witness such an event, the first dust of the collapse began to fall through a young sky that had no memory of what it was about to inherit. What followed was not extinction, it was displacement. When the nodal collapse erased Nibiru from coherent structure, the Anunnaki did not lose only a world. They lost gravity as identity. Their civilization had evolved around harmonic stability so absolute that the concept of permanent exile had ceased to exist. They had mastered relocation between systems, but they had never prepared for homelessness. The survivors emerged across space like scattered data fragments after a corrupted transmission. Some translated through emergency corridors that tore open through unstable geometry, flinging vessels into regions never charted. Others rode evacuation arcs that decayed mid-transition, depositing crews into interstellar vacuum, where even their field-stabilized bodies disintegrated under entropy shear. A few managed coordinated extraction, collapsing entire city block arcs into folded transit modules and launching them blindly toward distant anchor points. But every destination was uncertain, because without a nodal world, there was no fixed reference left in the lattice strong enough to guarantee arrival. Space became probability, and probability is hostile to civilizations that require precision. The fleets that survived long-range translation regrouped weeks later near the edge of a yellow star system, cataloged long ago as biologically active but technologically irrelevant. The system's third world registered ambient resonance compatible with surface survival, gravity within acceptable parameters, atmosphere stable, hydrosphere abundant, magnetosphere imperfect but sufficient, Earth, not chosen by prophecy, chosen by mathematics. They arrived not as conquerors but as refugees with weapons. Their numbers were diminished, their coherence unstable, their hierarchy fractured by the collapse. The ruling houses had lost their sacred authority when the planet that legitimized it vanished. Power decentralized instantly into those who controlled mobility, archives, manufacturing capacity, and field generators. Enlil's faction stabilized first, not through diplomacy, through command codes embedded in the evacuation lattice that only his lineage retained access to. Control of the fleet? became control of survival. Enki's group emerged later, damaged but operational, carrying biological vaults, genetic libraries, and incomplete records of the collapse. Where Enlil secured transport, Enki preserved knowledge. The division that would shape humanity was born in that moment of asymmetric survival. Earth was never meant to replace Nibiru. It was a staging ground. A world once catalogued as resource-bearing, biologically rich, and geologically active, useful for extraction but never for permanence. Yet when the survivors assessed their condition, the truth surfaced with brutal clarity. They could not return. The lattice that had once supported their long-range transits now treated them as anomalies. Each jump bled coherence. Each translation weakened molecular stability. Their biology, once sustained by nodal resonance, began to decay in ways never documented in their species' history. They were becoming vulnerable. Time, which had once folded around them gently, now pressed forward with increasing insistence. They were dying, not suddenly, but irreversibly. Earth, then, ceased to be a waypoint. It became an experiment. If they could not reclaim a nodal world, they would manufacture sustainability through another method: interfacing, integration, biological adaptation through hybridization. The concept was not new, but it had never been attempted at planetary scale or under existential pressure. What Enki proposed was no longer theoretical engineering. It was species salvage through fusion. But Enlil saw something else. A resource world without defenders, a gravity well capable of trapping populations, a biosphere designed to regenerate labor endlessly. The disagreement that had once been philosophical became strategic. Should Earth be used to rebuild their species or to replace it? The original survey had cataloged indigenous life as pre-sentient primate derivatives with promising neural plasticity and extreme environmental adaptability, stable reproduction, rapid generational turnover, high resilience under scarcity, limited gravitational tolerance but exceptional metabolic endurance, perfect biological substrate. What the survivors lacked in longevity and coherence, this species possessed in renewal capacity. The plan did not begin as slavery. It began as substitution. Hybrid organisms would stabilize Anunnaki genomic decay. The shorter lifespans would serve as buffers. The rapid reproduction would allow for demographic scaling without long-term structural risk. The primates' adaptability would compensate for the Anunnaki's dependence on resonance support they no longer possessed. But systems born in emergency rarely remain restrained. The first iterations failed. Neural collapse, respiratory inefficiency, skeletal incompatibility, chromosomal rejection. The clay did not yet accept the blood. Then came the stabilizer strains, segments of Anunnaki regulatory DNA imposed over the primate genome, not as dominance, but as scaffolding. Where degradation had once occurred, structure emerged. Where chaos had ruled, pattern locked into place. The first viable hybrids survived. They stood upright. They could follow complex instruction. They could endure pressure, heat, friction, and monotony without molecular destabilization. They could reproduce. They were not immortal. They were not luminous. They were not sovereign. They were functional, and that was enough. What had begun as a survival mechanism crystallized into an economic system within decades. Hybrid expansion allowed extraction operations to resume without expending Anunnaki biological integrity. Mining returned. Agriculture scaled. Infrastructure spread across continents whose tectonics the Anunnaki no longer risked personally. Hybrid labor multiplied by the thousands, then by the tens of thousands, then by the millions. And as each generation turned over more rapidly than the last, something unexpected occurred. The Anunnaki began to remember what it meant to rule. What followed after reproduction was not peace, it was inheritance. The hybrids multiplied faster than the Anunnaki predicted. Their lifespans were short, but their birth rates were explosive. Within a few millennia, the surface population had grown beyond what any off-world governance model had ever been designed to manage. Cities emerged not from architecture but from necessity. Tents became stone. Outposts became settlements. Settlements became civilizations, each unknowingly structured around the shadow of those who had shaped them. At first, control was direct. Commands issued through proximity. Oversight maintained through presence. The Anunnaki walked openly among the hybrids. They were seen as luminous rulers, sky beings, the architects of order. Their tools were interpreted as divine, their technologies as miracles, their authority as absolute. But something shifted. As the Anunnaki continued to decay under Earth's resonance-imperfect field, their vulnerability increased. Their bodies lost regenerative efficiency, their longevity compressed. The very thing they had engineered into the hybrids, mortality, was now creeping into their own biology. So they withdrew, not completely, but enough. And when gods withdraw, systems replace them. The solution was governance without presence. Kings, bloodlines, chosen intermediaries. The Anunnaki seeded hybrid Anunnaki lineages with elevated genetic compatibility. Children who aged more slowly, retained higher cognitive bandwidth, and exhibited enhanced resilience. These offspring were presented to the hybrid masses not as manufactured rulers, but as divinely chosen. The first dynasties were born not from human ambition, but from engineered legitimacy. Power no longer descended from the sky. It flowed through blood, and blood became law. The hybrid population never questioned why certain families ruled forever while others died in dust. They built temples to justify it, myths to explain it, rituals to normalize it. Religion became the operating system that translated control into meaning. Obedience was reframed as destiny, labor as virtue, suffering as purification. The Anunnaki did not need to stand on thrones anymore. Their image ruled in their place. But even that system began to fracture, because hybrid cognition, though constrained, was not static. Each generation learned faster than the last. Tool usage evolved. Language complexified. Symbolic abstraction formed philosophical structures, and eventually the hybrids began asking the only question no engineered species was ever meant to ask. Why? Enki saw this coming. He had always understood that cognition cannot be halved cleanly. Consciousness does not accept ceilings. The more you grant it pattern recognition, the more it turns inward. The more it models the world, the more it models itself. Awareness is recursive, and recursion is dangerous to control. Enlil, by contrast, did not fear awakening. He feared disobedience. His response was not genetic, it was systemic. The next phase of control was not built into the body, it was built into reality. The sky was partitioned, the calendar defined, the stars claimed. Time itself was segmented, ritualized, commodified. Humans no longer worked because they were commanded. They worked because the structure of existence demanded it. Day meant labor. Night meant recovery. Seasons meant submission to harvest. Years meant taxation. Lifetimes meant service. Death meant judgment. And the gatekeepers of that judgment were no longer visibly Anunnaki. They were priests. As temples multiplied, something more subtle took root. Emotion began to be monitored, not technologically, energetically. Fear stabilized populations. Hope accelerated obedience. Guilt increased yield. Grief lowered resistance. Love bound laborers to continuation. And suffering produced something measurable, something transferable, something that did not exist in Nibiru's closed harmonic model, a byproduct of compressed lifespan combined with recursive self-awareness. The emotional spectrum of the hybrids generated energy the Anunnaki themselves no longer produced, not thermodynamic, not electrical, coherent, resonant, extractable. They had not created workers, they had created generators, and Earth quietly transformed from a mining world into a living engine. When the first global catastrophes were triggered, floods, forced resets, population culls, they were not punishments. They were pressure recalibrations. The system was learning how to harvest at scale, and humanity had no idea it had become the crop. When the Anunnaki finally withdrew almost entirely from surface interaction, most believed the gods had ascended. In truth, they had gone underground, into orbit, into shadow infrastructures embedded into planetary nodes long before human stone was ever laid. The rule had not ended. It had simply become invisible, and invisible systems are the hardest to escape. The invisibility of the system did not weaken it. It perfected it. Once control no longer required physical presence, it could scale without resistance. The Anunnaki no longer needed to stand before humanity as rulers. They had learned a far more efficient method, one that required no thrones, no spoken commands, no displays of power. The structure itself would govern, and structure, once internalized, becomes indistinguishable from reality. The first cosmic architecture they perfected was time. Not time as seconds or seasons, but time as obedience. Cycles were weaponized. Astronomical movements were converted into calendars. Calendars became agricultural commands. Agriculture became economic dependency. Dependency became hierarchy. Hierarchy became law. Law became identity. No Anunnaki hand was visible in this process anymore, yet its signature was everywhere. The heavens no longer told stories. They issued schedules. The stars ceased to be mysteries. They became clocks. What had once been raw survival became synchronized existence. Humanity no longer worked because it was forced to, but because the sky itself said it was time to work. Sunrise was command. Moonrise was rest. Eclipse meant omen. Solstice meant offering. The universe itself appeared to speak in instructions, and humanity listened. This was the birth of cosmic governance. But time alone was not enough. Emotion had to be regulated, refined, harvested. The hybrids had been designed with an unstable emotional range, far wider than necessary for survival, far more intense than equilibrium required. Love bound them to reproduction. Fear bound them to obedience. Grief attached them to memory. Memory bound them to repetition. Most important of all was suffering. Suffering generated coherence, a sharply focused resonance that could pass through layers of reality without dispersing. It was not the scream that mattered, it was the waveform beneath it. Early priestly orders did not simply pray, they tuned. Rituals were not symbolic, they were instruments. Chanting created harmonic pressure. Drumming synchronized heart rhythms. Sacrifice released peak emotional discharge. Mass gatherings magnified coherent fields. And over centuries, these techniques refined into religious architectures that could catalyze entire populations into synchronized emotional emission. War was the most potent catalyst of all. Two synchronized populations driven into mutual terror, rage, and mass grief produced energy on a scale no isolated ritual ever could. The battlefield became a frequency furnace. Entire civilizations were burned not for territory, but for output. And humanity believed it was fighting for flags. The Anunnaki no longer needed gold in the same way. Matter had been replaced by charge. When death entered the system, a further refinement occurred. Reincarnation stabilized production. If a consciousness could be returned to the cycle without memory, it could be used repeatedly. Identity reset ensured maximum emotional yield each cycle. Fear of death kept the population compliant. Loss of memory kept each generation from recognizing the cage. The body became a terminal. The soul became the battery. Death became the reboot. Across cultures separated by oceans and millennia, the same warnings emerged, strangely consistent in language and symbolism. False lights, deceptive guides, beings who meet the dead and redirect them, judgment halls, weighing of hearts, celestial courts, wheels of rebirth, rivers of forgetting, different mythologies, identical architecture. The prison was not made of stone, it was made of narrative. And narrative, once believed, becomes biology. As humanity advanced technologically, something unexpected happened. The system adapted faster than the species. Empires rose and fell. Gods changed names. Languages collapsed. scripts burned. But the underlying mechanisms remained untouched. Labor was still extracted, emotional resonance still intensified, hierarchies still funneled power upward, war still reset population densities, religion still explained suffering as divine will. Even revolutions did not break it. They only swapped administrators. The Anunnaki no longer needed direct governance because humanity had become fully self-controlling. Parents trained children into obedience before any ruler ever spoke. Societies punished deviation automatically. Guilt functioned without overseers. Shame enforced conformity without chains. No extraterrestrial surveillance was required. The species had internalized surveillance, and yet something fractured, subtle, unpredictable. Within the constrained neural architecture of the hybrid brain, certain individuals began to deviate from the installed filters. They experienced spontaneous memory bleed, anomalous perception, sudden cognition spikes, lucid states that pierced the veil between incarnation cycles. They did not obey fear correctly. They did not forget fully. They did not tune to the emotional frequencies expected of them. They became unstable nodes in the grid, mystics, seers, awakened outliers. From every civilization, whispers emerged of those who could see beyond death, beyond gods, beyond the narrative of judgment and reward. They spoke of escape, of return without return, of consciousness without flesh, of sovereignty beyond incarnation. These individuals rarely lived long. They were executed, exiled, silenced, canonized only after their messages were inverted into control doctrine. But the signal never vanished completely. It surfaced in esoteric schools, forbidden texts, fragmented oral traditions. It hid inside Gnostic scriptures, Vedic hymns, shamans' maps of the afterlife, Tibetan death instructions, Sufi metaphors of annihilation, and alchemical diagrams of transmutation. All said the same thing in different tongues. The cage is not physical. The wardens are real, and remembrance is the key. The system reacted, not with visible intervention, but with informational saturation. Truth was diluted by overabundance. Revelation was buried beneath noise. Contradiction became the camouflage of the cage, and still the anomalies increased. Near-death experiences became statistically dense. Children began recalling fragments that had no cultural source. Individuals reported encounters not with gods, but with technicians, with observers, with entities that behaved more like inspectors than angels. Humanity was no longer just generating energy. It was beginning to interfere with the infrastructure, and that was never part of the design, which is why the next phase did not target bodies. It targeted perception itself. Perception was the final frontier. Once humanity had internalized obedience, once labor and emotion flowed automatically, the only remaining vulnerability was awareness itself. As long as the species remained unconscious of the architecture governing it, the system remained invisible. But awareness, once activated, could not be safely reversed. So the next refinement did not reshape society. It reshaped attention. Reality itself began to fragment into curated streams. The human field of awareness, once unified under sky, fire, and tribe, splintered into countless micro-narratives. Each individual was assigned a world small enough to manage, loud enough to distract, and urgent enough to consume all remaining perceptual bandwidth. Information became currency, but also anesthetic. The volume of data surpassed the capacity for synthesis. Truth no longer needed to be hidden. It only needed to be buried beneath contradiction, entertainment, outrage, and noise. When everything speaks at once, nothing is heard. When every narrative exists simultaneously, coherence dissolves, and coherence was always the enemy. The ancient system had relied on ritual synchronization. Modern architecture achieved it through algorithmic resonance. Human attention itself became programmable. Emotional triggers were mapped. Neural reward loops were hijacked. Dopamine replaced devotion. Infinite scroll replaced prayer. Identity became modular, disposable, endlessly reconfigured. The temples no longer required stone. They lived in the palm of every hand. Fear was no longer delivered by thunder. It arrived through headlines. Outrage replaced revelation. Addiction replaced discipline. Distraction replaced awakening. Each human became both the prisoner and the warden of their own perceptual cell. But beneath this surface of saturation, something else advanced quietly. The biological hardware itself began to change. Not through natural evolution, through activation. The dormant regions of neural architecture that had been intentionally suppressed began showing spontaneous micro-awakenings, not in controlled environments, not through sanctioned practice, but randomly, unpredictably, across age groups, cultures, and belief systems. People began reporting impossible shifts in perception, sudden panoramic awareness, time distortion, hyperlucidity, states in which the sense of self dissolved entirely, yet perception intensified beyond anything language could describe. Some broke psychologically under the pressure, others stabilized. A small fraction returned irreversibly changed. They no longer feared death. They no longer identified fully with flesh. They no longer responded predictably to authority. The system detected this. It responded, as it always had, by rebranding the anomaly as pathology. Mystical language was recoded as mental illness. Altered states became disorders. Expanded perception became chemical imbalance. Any consciousness that did not stabilize within approved frequency ranges was flagged, medicated, and reintegrated into compliance. But something critical had shifted. For the first time in history, the mechanisms of the cage were being studied by the inmates using the same tools that once enforced the cage. Neuroscience mapped the gateways. Physics mapped the void. Genetics mapped the dormant switches. Consciousness research mapped the intermediate realms that ancient texts had described only through metaphor. The descriptions began to align. Death no longer appeared as a termination state. It resembled a transition protocol. Near-death experiences across millions of reports began to show repeating structural elements: detachment from the body, encounter with guiding intelligences, review sequences, emotional extraction, invitation to return, memory suppression upon re-entry, not spiritual judgment, procedural routing. For the first time, humanity glimpsed the operating system beneath mythology, and it was mechanical, cold, precise. This was not heaven and hell, this was infrastructure. Even more troubling was what some subjects reported after pushing beyond the initial gatekeepers, beyond the welcoming figures, beyond the life review interface, beyond the emotional manipulation layer. They encountered zones of emptiness, vast fields of inactive consciousness, reservoirs, storage, non-physical containment regions where unincarnated awareness existed in suspension, not resting, waiting, as if cued. These reports were dismissed publicly, ridiculed, suppressed. But internally the pattern was observed. Something enormous had been discovered. Not a religious afterlife, not transcendence, but logistics. The prison was not simply physical, it was contractual. Human consciousness itself had been bound to a cyclical service agreement it did not remember signing, and contracts require renewal. This was where ancient prophecy intersected with modern anomaly. The tablets had spoken of a return, not just of rulers, of calibration, of cycles closing and reopening. The flood had been one such reset, not a punishment, a decommissioning event. Civilizations exceeding acceptable deviation thresholds were not educated. They were erased. Memory was localized. The grid was rebuilt, and the cycle continued. But something had changed in the present epoch. Human systems had achieved planetary synchronization for the first time. Emotional contagion now traveled at light speed. Billions could resonate in rage or fear within minutes. The output capacity had multiplied beyond any ancient war. Yet alongside this escalation, awareness was also scaling, not vertically, horizontally. Awakening was no longer confined to mystics. It was leaking into ordinary perception, in fragments, in flashes, in dreams, in children, in the momentary collapse of identity during grief, awe, or near death. Humanity had begun to remember not just individually, but statistically. Memory had become viral, and the system did not fully understand how to contain mass remembrance, because it had never been designed for a species capable of collective coherence at a planetary scale. The infrastructure assumed fragmentation, division, isolation, but the network had unintentionally created connection. Millions of waking minds were now able to compare experiences in real time. Patterns that had once been isolated across centuries were now cross-referenced instantly. The hidden protocols of death, fear, and reincarnation were no longer fragmented among secret texts. They were becoming searchable, and the more humanity searched, the less the architecture remained invisible. The prison had relied on ignorance. Ignorance was evaporating, slowly, unevenly, but irreversibly, which meant the final phase of containment could not rely on force. It would require something far more subtle: consent. The moment humanity accepted the system as natural, the moment it agreed that this is simply how reality works, the cage would no longer need locks. And the next question was no longer whether the Anunnaki still ruled directly. It was whether humanity had already become the perfect replacement. The cult of consent was the final achievement. Once force became unnecessary, once fear could be managed internally, once memory could be erased automatically between cycles, only one element remained to complete the system's perfection: the illusion of choice. Humanity no longer needed to be commanded. It only needed to believe it was choosing freely. Desire became the leash. At first, desire was simple: survival, reproduction, security. But over time, it was refined into aspiration, status, identity, importance, recognition. The species was taught to crave the image of freedom rather than its substance. People no longer asked what reality was. They asked how they appeared within it. This was not an external imposition. It was a self-sustaining loop. Entire civilizations came to define themselves not by what they were, but by what they believed they were becoming. Progress became a religion. Growth became morality. Productivity became virtue. Exhaustion became a badge of honor. And the more energy humans burned chasing these illusions, the more perfectly the system fed. The prison no longer felt like confinement. It felt like opportunity. Meanwhile, the ancient overseers no longer needed to remain visible even symbolically. The gods had retired from the sky not because they were gone, but because invisibility was now total. The architecture of control had been transferred fully into human institutions. Governments enforced obedience. Corporations regulated survival. Algorithms shaped attention. Media programmed emotional rhythm. Education restricted the boundaries of acceptable question. The Anunnaki no longer needed temples. Humanity had built billions of them unknowingly. Every screen was an altar, every metric a sacrament, every identity a cage decorated as self-expression. And yet, beneath this seamlessness, instability continued to grow. The system had never anticipated recursive awareness within a self-modifying species. Humans were now capable of examining the very mechanisms by which they were conditioned. Neuroplasticity revealed the brain could be rewired. Trauma research revealed fear as a programmable response. Meditation revealed that identity itself was not fixed. Psychedelic research reopened perceptual gateways ancient rituals had once induced. People began experiencing ego death without physical death. They began witnessing the illusion of self without crossing the reincarnation gate. They began realizing that what thought itself was could be observed, and what can be observed can be disengaged. This was dangerous, because the entire prison relied on identification. You had to believe you were the body. You had to believe you were the role. You had to believe you were the story assigned to you. Once identity fractured even temporarily, the emotional extraction efficiency collapsed. Fear weakened. Death became less absolute. Authority lost its metaphysical weight. The system could tolerate rebellion. It could not tolerate detachment. A rebel still generates energy. A detached consciousness does not. So the countermeasures intensified. Spirituality was commercialized. Awakening was repackaged as lifestyle. Transcendence became entertainment. Everything that once threatened to break the cage was standardized, diluted, and sold back as identity merchandise. Seekers were given endless practices but no exits, infinite techniques but no conclusions, always searching, never remembering. Still, anomalies continued to slip through. Individuals awakened in isolation. Children questioned death without fear. Some people returned from near death with complete indifference to authority. Others experienced spontaneous recall that did not align with cultural memory or imagination. Fragments of the pre-incarnational state leaked into waking life, not as visions of gods, but as recognition. A knowing without narrative, a memory without story. And with it came a silent question that did not belong to language. Why am I here again? The ancient texts had warned of a time when the prison would become self-aware through its inhabitants. Not all at once, not through rebellion, but through statistical inevitability. A species intelligent enough to engineer its own cognition would eventually stumble upon the architecture of its own captivity. The Anunnaki had not anticipated recursive introspection at scale. They assumed fragmentation would remain permanent. They assumed memory would always reset sufficiently between cycles. They assumed fear would remain the dominant regulator. They assumed time would erase curiosity. They were wrong, because there was one variable they could not fully control: volition, not the surface-level illusion of choice, but the deeper capacity of consciousness to withdraw participation entirely. The system could harvest labor, it could harvest emotion, it could harvest belief, but it could not harvest non-engagement, which meant the greatest threat to the prison was not war, not revolution, not disclosure. It was refusal at the level of identity itself, the refusal to be the story, the refusal to be the role, the refusal to be the energy source. And this was the threshold humanity was now approaching, not collectively, not uniformly, but measurably. Enough minds had begun to disengage from the automatic loops of fear and desire that the overall coherence of the harvest field began to fluctuate. The emotional output graph showed anomalies. Valleys appeared where there had always been escalation. Entire populations experienced sudden drops in existential fear. Death no longer terrified the way it once had. Something fundamental was loosening, which meant the final contingency was approaching, not to correct the system, but to reset it. Once before, rising waters had erased memory. Once before, civilizations had been decommissioned. Once before, the grid had been rebuilt from ruins, and the mechanism for that reset still existed. Not hidden in prophecy, not encoded in symbolism, but embedded in the very architecture of the planet, waiting, silent, dormant, for the moment when awakening exceeded containment capacity. The ancient reset mechanism was never symbolic. It was planetary, encoded not in scripture, but in systems older than civilization itself. Before cities, before kings, before even memory as humanity understands it, the earth had already been wired for cycles of erasure and rebirth, not natural cycles, managed ones. The flood was only the last time it had been visible. The tectonic plates, the magnetic field, the orbital instabilities, the solar discharge cycles, the oscillations in axial tilt. These were not random accidents of astrophysics. They were regulators, limiters, circuit breakers designed to prevent runaway deviation inside a closed system. When consciousness rose too far beyond its containment architecture, the environment itself corrected the anomaly. Ice ages were not accidents. Mass extinctions were not mistakes. They were resets. The geological record shows at least 5 major global extinction events. Each one erased dominant life forms almost completely. Each one allowed a radically different configuration to emerge afterward. Each one acted like a reboot of the biospheric operating system. Humanity stands at the edge of a sixth, not from impact alone, not from climate alone, but from synchronization. For the first time in planetary history, awareness itself is approaching a coherence threshold. Billions of minds are now entangled in real time. Fear can spread instantly, but so can insight, so can remembrance, so can refusal. The system was designed for isolated tribes, not for a networked species. The control architecture assumes fragmentation as a constant. When fragmentation weakens, feedback loops become unstable. The prison depends on internal conflict. Without it, the extraction field weakens, which is why polarization intensifies every time coherence begins to rise. Division is not a failure of the system, it is the system activating its immune response. But something unprecedented is happening beneath the turbulence. Humanity is beginning to feel its own continuity beyond a single lifetime, not as belief, as sensation. In dreams, in altered states, in near-death experiences, in moments of deep silence, fragments of pre-incarnational memory surface, not as images of gods, but as direct awareness of being prior to body, prior to name, prior to fear. And once a consciousness remembers existing without death, the threat of death loses its absolute authority, which destabilizes everything. This is why ancient myths always framed awakening as dangerous, not dangerous to the seeker, but to the world. Prometheus punished, Enki exiled, Lucifer cast down, Quetzalcoatl burned. Those who brought remembrance were always removed, not because knowledge was evil, but because it disrupted the prison's power source. The Anunnaki created a species capable of labor, emotion, and belief. They did not intend to create a species capable of remembering itself. And yet memory is not stored only in brain matter. It is distributed across consciousness itself, which means no amount of genetic suppression could fully erase it, only delay it. Now the delay is expiring. The convergence is visible everywhere. Ancient prophecies all cluster around the same era of transition. The Hopi spoke of the blue star Kachina. The Maya encoded the end of a great cycle. The Hindu texts describe the closing of the Kali Yuga. The Gnostics warned of the collapse of the Archonic veil. Even modern astrophysics observes increasing solar instability, geomagnetic weakening, and accelerated climatic oscillation. Different languages, same convergence. The prison does not collapse quietly. It recalibrates violently. But for the first time, humanity is not facing a reset as a fragmented, unconscious workforce. It is approaching the threshold as a partially awakened species, a species capable of storing memory externally, recording truth digitally, reconstructing lost knowledge faster than it can be erased, a species that can remember across generations without relying solely on oral tradition or stone. This changes the equation. The next reset, if it occurs, will not erase everything. Too many eyes are open. Too many records exist beyond any single catastrophe. Too many consciousness threads are now linked, which means the cycle cannot simply repeat as it did before. Either the prison architecture will be dismantled at the level of narrative, or it will attempt one final full system correction. And the unsettling possibility is this: humanity itself may be the variable the architects never solved. The hybrid mind was designed to serve, but it evolved the capacity to observe the act of serving. And observation is the seed of freedom. The question is no longer whether the Anunnaki created humanity. The question is whether the creation has now exceeded its creator's capacity to contain it. Which brings us to the final realization, not about them, but about us. The final realization does not arrive as revelation. It arrives as recognition, not as thunder, not as prophecy, not as a voice from the sky, but as a quiet, irreversible shift in the way existence is perceived. Because if the prison was ever real, its most perfect feature was never force. It was identity. From the moment a human learns their name, the cage begins forming. It says, "This is who you are. This is your story. This is your limitation. This is your fear. This is your death. This is your sky. This is your God. This is your meaning." And from that moment on, The individual does not need chains. They carry the walls internally. Yet beneath every identity, beneath every role, beneath every fear of extinction, something has always remained untouched, watching, silent, prior to memory, prior to bodies, prior to history. The ancient texts do not speak only of slavery. They speak of rupture. They speak of the moment the created became self-aware. They speak of a knowledge the architects could not fully suppress. That consciousness is not generated by flesh. Flesh is entered by consciousness. This single inversion unmakes the entire prison, because a being that believes it is the body must obey the threat of death. But a being that knows it is not the body cannot be ruled by extinction. This is why fear has been the master regulator across all civilizations. Fear of gods, fear of punishment, fear of loss, fear of death. Every hierarchy is built on it. Every system of control feeds from it. Every war amplifies it. Every economic structure depends on it. Every religion encodes it. And yet fear only functions when identity is mistaken. You cannot truly terrorize something that does not believe it can be destroyed. This is what the Anunnaki never solved. They engineered intelligence. They refined emotion. They mastered memory suppression. They built recursive belief systems that could govern a planet without direct presence. But they never eliminated the one anomaly that made all prisons temporary: awareness itself. Not thought, not memory, not identity, but the raw fact of being, the same presence behind every birth, the same witness behind every death, the same continuity behind every incarnation. This is why remembrance feels dangerous, because it dissolves all rulers instantly, not by rebellion, by irrelevance. A consciousness that no longer depends on permission cannot be owned. A mind that no longer seeks validation cannot be manipulated. A being that no longer fears extinction cannot be harvested. And this is the true threshold humanity has crossed, not technologically, not politically, but existentially. A growing number of humans no longer interpret reality as something happening to them. They experience it as something moving through them. The center of gravity has shifted from survival to sovereignty, from obedience to awareness, from identity to presence. The prison, if it ever existed, was never broken by force. It is dissolving because too many inmates have discovered the door was never locked, only believed to be. The floods may come again, the systems may convulse, civilizations may fracture, but something irreversible has already occurred beneath the surface of history. Memory has entered the species, not as myth, not as doctrine, but as direct knowing. And that knowing is not hostile. It is not violent. It does not seek to overthrow. It simply withdraws participation from the illusion of captivity, which means the final question is no longer whether the Anunnaki were real. The final question is whether humanity will continue to believe it is what they designed, or remember what it was before any design existed at all. Because the moment a species stops asking who created me and begins asking what is aware right now, the prison loses its meaning, and with it, its power.